So I was going to get into check raising in this video, but I wanted to do one more video on some of the other spots before getting into check raises. And I want to talk about when the board or when the hand rather checks down to the river and how to play against a big blind bet. And we've kind of actually already covered how to play in the small blind, but I guess I just want to talk about how to play in the small blind facing the big blind bet. So in that situation, it's actually quite interesting because if it checks down to the river, now there's no more future bets that are going to be at play. And additionally, card removal doesn't really play that much of a role because both players' ranges are so weak that, even having like a hand like a pair is not going to be significant card removal because, like, let's say for example you're in the small blind and you have a jack on king jack 3. You decide to check twice and your opponent bets the river. While that is good, it's good to have a jack there. Your opponent's not going to have too many jacks in their betting range. Kings are going to bet the turn. Mid to strong jacks are going to bet the turn. So you really only block a few of the weak jacks. And if there is like a third or fourth pair that can be value betting, they're going to have all of those hands. So in those spots, card removal plays less of a role than when your opponent's value range is stuff like top pair only or top pair, two pair set type hands. So basically, in these situations, card removal plays less of a role. There's no future bets to think about. So in these situations, you actually have a pretty interesting and clear way of looking at it. And all you have to do on the river is take all of the hands you can get to the river with in the small blind. When they bet, now pick out your folds according to, obviously to some degree, showdown. But once you've folded all of your bluffs, your 7, 8, 9 high hands you were planning on double delay c-betting as a bluff, once you've folded those hands, which should be around 20, 15% of your range, something like that, now you're left with around 75 or 80% of your hands that are ace high or king high or better. And the way that you need to play this spot now is you have to fold out another 20-ish% of your hands to not allow a 2/3 pot bet to profit. So in this situation now, you have to pick out your calls. Now, the way that you should be picking calls should not be based on a linear approach. You should not fold your king highs, fold your ace highs, and call your pairs. And that's actually a strategy I've seen a lot of players use that I think is quite bad. If it gets to the river and the big blind bets and you're in the small blind, if you're planning on folding all your ace highs to a bet, you're going to way overfold there in the small blind, and that's not going to be a winning strategy against good players. So here's what you have to do. Once you fold all of the air that has checked down, the non-equity, didn't have any backdoor draws, didn't delay c-bet, that's still going to be around, a fourth, a fifth, a sixth of your range, probably closer to a fifth or a sixth of your range. Now you have to pick out what hands you're going to fold. And the single most important thing when looking at what hands you want to call is you do not want to have a deuce through 9 in your hand, especially like a 9 or an 8, that does not pair the board. and let me explain a little bit more on that. So let's say that the board is something like 10, 7, 3, turn deuce, river 9. In this situation, a 4, 5, and 6 are all non-paired. And so those cards are going to be the primary hands that your opponent's looking to bluff with. However, it's also worth noting that your opponents are more likely to play hands like a 6 pre-flop. So I do think that there's a little more value in blocking a 5 or a 6 in this example than a 4. But at the same time, those cards are all the most relevant because if your opponent decides to bluff, they're going to have some kind of high card hand, maybe jack high, maybe queen high, maybe 6 high. They're going to have some hand like that. Maybe like the 1-8 high, the 2-8 highs are possible as well. They're going to have a couple of those hands, and they're going to have those as their bluff hands. So you don't want to have cards there that block those hands that could be bluffing. Instead, you want to have hands that, in fact, don't block those hands. Like, for example, good calls in that spot are hands like ace-king, because your opponent's not going to bluff with an ace or a king-high hand. That's a good one. Hands like ace-queen, hands like king-queen. As you get into hands like queen-jack, it gets a lot less good. And also that hand should generally be betting on different streets. So you're not going to have hands like that. But you should call with hands like ace-2, ace-3, king-deuce, king-3. Obviously, if you have a 7, it's going to be too strong. You need to call that. Hands like pocket 4s, pocket 5s, you probably have to call in this exact example because there is a small percentage chance your opponent has chosen to bet a hand like pocket 4s or pocket 5s. So you always want to think about your showdown value first. And then once you've established what you think the minimum value bet your opponent will have is, then you want to look at it from a removal standpoint. So in this example, 4s, 5s, and 6s all make pretty bad calls from a removal standpoint, but they can actually beat some of your opponent's value bets in terms of the showdown, so you can't fold those hands. So obviously if they call 4s, 5s, and 6s, how they call it ace 3, king 3, ace deuce, king deuce, really you're not going to get to pick too many folds out because you can only fold about a fourth of your value bets. You're already folding a bunch of airs, so you need to make sure you're calling with your value bets fairly frequently. And I think that you should be picking out hands that really just avoid having a 4 through 6 in them. So ace 4, ace 5, ace 6, definitely going to fold those. Same thing with king 4 through king 6. And, you know, ace jack plus, king jack plus, those hands should be calling. The pair should call. The pair should especially call if it's a pair plus a high card. And once you've broken down the combos, you can kind of decide on hands like 4 deuce or 5 deuce if those hands are going to end up wanting to be calls as well. It is actually worth noting in those spots that 5 deuce is a much better call than a hand like ace 5 because 5 deuce does at least block some ability for your opponent to have 2 pair or some kind of trapped hand on the turn that decided to go for the check raise that bricked and now wants to bet the river. So having a pair is definitely better than those ace high hands. And I would say a good general rule is if it checks down to the river and you're in the small blind and your opponent makes a reasonable bet, unless the board is very, very easy to have better than a pair, you know, like 4 straight, 4 flush, a good general rule is you should be calling with those pairs because they're simply going to be too high up in your range combined with having some relatively good card removal. And then when you look at your ace and king highs, you're going to want to call with your very strong ones because they don't block. Sorry about that. They don't block the higher card hands, and or they don't block rather the lower card bluffs. And instead they do block maybe some of the stronger pairs that your opponent can have and be value betting. So that spot I think is pretty easy. I just wanted to give you kind of a walkthrough on that. To talk a little bit about raising there. Excuse me. So in these situations, when you do develop your raise range, you want to make sure you establish the call range first because for the reasons we've talked about before, if you get to that spot and you just start picking out raises, then you're in not a very good shape. What I would recommend doing is I would recommend picking out how many value raises you're going to have, picking out your size, figuring out how many combos that is. That should be something that we're getting very used to doing. And now look at your call range. Look at what hands you're going to have to call. In the example we just gave, a hand like ace jack or king jack, we're going to be calling with those hands. So then a hand like ace 8 would be a very reasonable raise on the river in that spot as a bluff because it's a hand we've chosen to fold, still does block a couple strong hands that are maybe possible for our opponent, and it's the strongest hand that we're going to be folding. So I know, again, we don't want to always look at it in a super linear way like that, but when I'm picking out my bluff allocation, I like to just, if I think removal is relatively neutral, pick out the hand that has the, in a linear sense, the highest showdown value, just to make sure that we don't have too many combos. So I'd be bluffing with a hand like ace 8 there. I would probably be only using it around a third of the time or half the time because we're not going to have too many value raises on that board. Maybe a couple, 2 pairs, but realistically not that many hands are going to want to raise there at all. So maybe it's more like a fourth of our combos. But we just do the exact same thing that I taught you earlier. We start with the value, we work in the bluffs, we figure out the amount of combos, figure out the size we're going to use, and we raise with a proportion of bluffs to make our opponent indifferent between call and fold. So I didn't really want to go too in depth on this spot specifically. I feel like it's pretty straightforward. If you want to do a couple exercises yourself to get more familiar with it, that could be good. But let's go ahead and jump into talking about check raising.